Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Robert K. Elder, and I'm the president and CEO of Outrider Foundation. And Outrider is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that supports multimedia storytelling about nuclear threats and climate change. We do this by partnering with creators, publishers, and thought leaders through journalism fellowships, reported pieces, and events such as today's program. We are delighted to again partner with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, this time to bring you a very important conversation on a quickly developing topic: the use of artificial intelligence, or AI, in nuclear command and control systems. Why is this topic important enough for two organizations to partner and raise concerns? Well, nuclear systems are highly complex, and they are designed to prioritize reliable information even under high pressure conditions. People, experienced people, remain critical to avoiding catastrophic mistakes. In stressful security situations with numerous information inputs and fast-paced decision-making, the desire to incorporate new technologies is high. This brings us to the advent of artificial intelligence. Today, we're grappling with the possibility of incorporating a technology that we do not fully understand or manage into a system that cannot fail. A single error can spell disaster. Any major change or a technology deployment must be flawless. Can we say that AI is ready? Our goal today is to understand the risks as they are unfolding, both in implementation and in policy, and to determine the actions needed in the near term to maintain the system's strength. Now, we have a distinguished group of experts to help us out today, and I'll briefly introduce them now. We have Dr. Paul Lushenko. He's a U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel whose work lies at the intersection of emerging tech, politics, and national security. He holds positions at the U.S. Army War College, George Washington University, Cornell University's Tech Policy Institute, and the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, as well as the nonprofit organization regulating AI. He's also the author of multiple books, including The Legitimacy of Drone Warfare, Evaluating Public Perceptions, published in 2024. Next, we have Eduardo Sánchez. Eduardo is the Director General for the United Nations in the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Recently, he was involved in authoring and presenting the Mexico-led resolution on AI command, control, and communication systems, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2025. Prior to this, he was the political coordinator at the permanent mission of Mexico to the United Nations. Also joining us is Leah Walker, the Executive Director of the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. Leah oversees the lab's research portfolio, which includes nuclear arms control, the governance of emerging technologies, industrial policy, and strategic competition. She also researches the governance of military and commercial artificial intelligence, as well as Russian and Chinese nuclear strategy. And leading the conversation today is Alexandra Bell. Alex is likely known to you all as the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Before this important appointment, Alex served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Affairs in the Bureau of Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability at the U.S. State Department. She has a long-established career in nuclear policy and arms control, including roles at the Center for Arms Control, the Council for a Livable World, Plowshares Fund, and the Center for American Progress. I look forward to the conversation and to your questions, which we will be monitoring over YouTube over the next 45 minutes. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Rob, for setting the stage. And also thank you to you and your colleagues at Outrider for the support in making today's very important conversation happening, and also for your tireless work to support media organizations covering these critical issues. As Rob outlined, the commingling of nuclear arsenals and disruptive technologies can and will present opportunities and risks, both seen and unforeseen. Our conversation today is just a small part of what needs to be a sustained and rigorous dialogue in the months and years ahead. We're going to jump right in, but as was said, you can keep an eye on the YouTube chat, and we'll try to weave your questions in as we go. So let's start with a basic question. Paul, why are militaries thinking about incorporating AI into sensitive military systems, including nuclear command and control, or as you'll hear us say many times today, NC3? What are the advantages here?
Yeah, so it's actually a really complicated question. And before I dig into it and give a pithy answer for our audience here, I think it may be useful to baseline what, in fact, artificial intelligence is, because if you ask different audiences, you'll likely get different answers. So the quintessential definition of artificial intelligence is really a compilation of data. We would like it to be representative of a certain environment, algorithms that are enhanced in certain ways to call through that data. And finally is compute, and a lot of compute power, which is why you see the emergence of data centers across the United States, the Global South, and elsewhere. And so if we step back to your original question, I think the core assumption here is that artificial intelligence can shorten the sensor to shooter timeline, which is to say the interval of time between identifying a target and then applying an effect, in this case, a very lethal kinetic effect, which would allow a adversary to outpace his or her opponent. And so that's a great way to understand the incorporation of AI into nuclear command and control, that you would have data, you would have algorithms that allow you to shorten that sensor to shooter timeline.
Okay, so Eduardo and Leah, in addition to what Paul outlined of why we're doing this, can you think about and talk about the potential benefits of the incorporation of AI into NC3? So Leah, we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, picking up from where Paul left off, every country is facing different pressures at the moment and is facing different strategic ecosystems. And so their interest in integrating AI into their nuclear enterprise and NC3 is usually tied to that. For example, the US right now feels that it has to respond to a changing multipolar nuclear environment, including two near peer or peer adversaries in Russia and China. Because of that, it needs to have greater visibility and sort of needs to extend itself from what was previously more of a bipolar relationship vis-a-vis Russia and the Soviet Union to account for another very substantial nuclear peer. And so for the US, I think a lot of it is about the time, but it's also about greater operational capacity and greater operational situational awareness, just having more eyes and more ability to act quickly on a number of different fronts while still accounting for, as we've seen noted in government publications over government publications and in the real world, the very real reality for the US that while it's aiming to deter two near peer adversaries, it's also very likely having to respond and potentially engage with conventional conflicts around the world. So I think for the US, there's this sort of view of artificial intelligence, yes, improving responsive time, as Paul stated, but also just enabling us to more proactively engage on a mission set that has really radically expanded in the past several years. That calculus is different for other countries. I think you look at countries like Pakistan, for example. Pakistan feels that it's in a fairly vulnerable position vis-a-vis India, and that's one place where timing, just pulling from Paul's comment, timing really matters. The distance between India and Pakistan is not much at all. And Pakistan has had some unpleasant surprises in the past few years that's reminded it just how important early warning is. And so that's one country where integration is going to be much more focused on that early warning capability. And then you think about potential countries like North Korea, and we have very limited insights into North Korean AI integration in NC3. To be honest, we have fairly limited insights into North Korean NC3. But I like to use them as an example of a country who might think of artificial intelligence as an assurance value. That's a country where the arsenal, fairly fledgling, up until a few years ago, there really was not much NC3 infrastructure, and NC3 can be about detecting attacks, but it's also the vehicle in which you're able to issue orders and actually launch, if you choose to do so, a nuclear attack. And so if you think about North Korea, where you have a fledgling arsenal that's maybe not as technically sound as you may want, that might not have all the communication systems in place to effectively communicate to launch, especially if something happens to Kim Jong-un, that might be the sort of country who might be interested in integrating AI in a way that assures adversaries that launch would be able to occur.
Thanks. Paul, would you like to jump in on that?
Yeah, real quick. I think this point that Leah is making about deterrence is a really important one, because we know deterrence, of course, is fundamental to at least U.S. foreign policy and military strategy, but it's also difficult to prove empirically because it's beliefs about other people's beliefs. And to the extent we have some empirical data that surrounds deterrence and AI incorporation into NC3, what we find is that when you actually incorporate AI into nuclear command and control, akin to potentially a so-called dead man switch during the Cold War era, it increases perceptions of deterrence among the general population. And this is a pretty strong finding cross-nationally. And I might just also add that it is conditioned upon the country of which is determining whether or not to incorporate AI. And so in this case, if Russia under Putin were to state publicly, we have AI in this capacity, what happens among the public is a real strong belief that they would potentially use it, and therefore deterrence increases as well.
Eduardo, Leah?
Oh, yes, just one more thing. So adding to the deterrent side of things, I think it's also important to note that a lot of the discussion of integration, when it's coming from countries, and Paul's Russia point brought this up for me, there is a real incentive for countries to indicate that they're integrating new technologies into their nuclear enterprise, because it shows a modernizing and sort of lively nuclear enterprise, which is something that you want to demonstrate for a deterrent value. I would say particularly in the case of Russia, Russia has on paper not really promising nuclear modernization. They've really stalled in their modernization. The modernized bomber hasn't come onto the scene. They're delayed on their submarine deliveries. And obviously the Russian forces have been, battered in a massive land war for years. And so on paper, that's not a modernized military that's gearing up for the next war. That's a military that's still very much feeling the repercussion of their last war. But I think the Russians have been fairly strategic in trying to field what we would call, exotic weapons like Burevestnik, the nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable cruise missile, or Poseidon, the nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable torpedo, both of which they tout as having high degrees of autonomy, et cetera, by making those claims and saying that these, new capabilities are coming out and they're so technologically advanced, it paints a much more appealing picture of nuclear modernization than the one on paper. And that has its own deterrent value. And I think that's really critical for signaling, also for signaling that a country is technologically capable, which matters in today's strategic age.
Thanks, Leah. Eduardo, before we switch over to potential risks, any thoughts on potential benefits of this incorporation, including from a government perspective?
Yeah, thank you. No, just I would like to think that what both Paul and Leah have mentioned as the rationale behind many of the countries trying to incorporate this is very true. I would say that the integration of artificial intelligence in general to the military is something that we're seeing, and any country, any government that's not being up to speed on this is really falling behind. So we know that all countries are trying to integrate it one way or another. I do think that when it comes to nuclear, we're talking about a very different ballgame, and this is where I think the larger conversation needs to be had. But in general, I would say that the strategic advantage that some countries are observing is the need to integrate AI one way or another, but with this difficulty of knowing how to nuance it in a way that they will keep up their deterrent capabilities without giving too much information about what is really going on or what is really on the ground, what the AI can actually do for them. So I think it's a little bit of a game in terms of how AI is being portrayed. The actual benefits, like Paul was saying, we have limited empirical evidence of how it is being used in the day-to-day world, and especially when it comes to very specific nuclear deterrent capabilities that any country would have. But of course, this is a larger conversation about AI being integrated in the military one way or another. It can be from the very basic functions to something completely advanced. And I would say every country is looking into how to integrate AI for their own military defense or offensive purposes.
Okay, so that's a good segue into the risks. We have heard about why countries might be pursuing this integration, but the danger of this integration, is something that we should be focused on too. I know there's a lot in this space, but let's have each of you give the thing you're most worried about the integration of AI into nuclear command and control. And Eduardo, why don't we start with you?
Sure, and especially what I was saying before, I think that when we're talking about the nuclear side, it's a completely different ballgame than anything else in the military. We can say that we can see different aspects, for example, of integrating AI for a better protection of civilians when it comes to a live conflict, or something of protection of IHL, or ensuring that IHL is better thought into. But when we're talking about nuclear deterrence, you're really thinking about expanding the capabilities of ensuring that any country that possesses these technologies will have the advantage over the adversary. And when we're talking about a technology that has not been proven on the day-to-day battlefield, we do not know the extent of how much AI would be able to control the ultimate moment where a nuclear weapon can be launched, then we're talking about something that could have catastrophic consequences. Imagine if there's AI systems that are programmed to detect just a launch, and they're then at the same time hyped up with all of these new technologies. You see something, then another country will be reacting to that, and then it's a spiral that we could not be able to control. The main risk is knowing also what extent a human will be able to control anything when it comes to AI. We see that there's automation for some procedures, but in some other cases, there's not much clarity about how much a human would be in the loop. And there's where I would see that we have very different policies from all of those countries that have nuclear weapons of how they would be looking at this. Some will be saying that they would have higher authorities being able to log into what they would have to be authorizing as a nuclear launch. In other cases, and we've seen this already from the Cold War examples, that there were fully automated systems that would be creating that deterrent. So in not knowing the full control of a human versus the AI controlling, when we're talking about the most powerful and destructive weapons ever created, that is where we see the greater risk. Over to you.
Thanks for that. Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts, but it's too bad we have limited time here. But what I may do is just bin my feedback in three different ways. One is for the technical implications of AI for command and control. Two is how operators, ostensible operators, soldiers, airmen, Marine Corps personnel would think about this in terms of trust. And then finally is what do observers, all of us, civilians, mothers, dads, brothers, what do we think about the potential here as well? So on the technical aspect, I think we have to be aware of the unmitigated potential for hallucinations across large language models that are invested into command and control for nuclear weapons. And I just point to the great work, empirical research by Missy Cummins at George Mason University, who has drawn an analogy from driverless vehicles about the way that it's very, very difficult to actually attenuate hallucinations, or what has otherwise been called illusionary inference. And on another technical point is, to the extent we have any empirical data, to Eduardo's point, and it's very limited, what we can see is that these large language models have a tendency to escalate very rapidly in terms of crisis escalation that would lead countries to consider the use of nuclear weapons. And that's pretty scary. And so what we really have to point to is the importance of leaders in risk calculation in this context as a way to potentially balance against that. As we transition to operators, and we can unpack this in great detail, really the central thrust of my research is how the public and military thinks about these capabilities. Trust is not a foregone conclusion. It is multidimensional, and it's very, very complicated. And so when we start to make assumptions across countries that we're going to use these capabilities and soldiers will automatically trust them, it's not really well placed. Really, trust is conditioned upon instrumental considerations like chance of success, protection of my own forces, but also normative considerations, ethical considerations of reducing risk to civilians, as Eduardo has pointed to as well. And finally, when we talk about public opinion, which at least in democracies really should demonstrate democratic accountability and public oversight, when we start talking about AI-enabled capabilities, so lethally autonomous weapon systems that turn targets into simple blips on a screen, we find much less support for these operations. And I think we can draw usefully, potentially, from that data to really kind of look at the counterfactual of what a world with AI-enabled nuclear command and control looks like in terms of public support.
And I'm going to stop you just briefly to get you to explain to people who don't know, what is an AI hallucination and why does AI hallucinate? As quickly as you can. I know that could be a whole dissertation.
No, and for the record, I am not an AI expert, but from my understanding of the literature and reading a lot and really integrating into the sort of governance of the incorporation of these capabilities into military systems, what we talk about is the way that the algorithms are written, coded, in other words, and the weight that is put in terms of different assumptions within that code. And more importantly, if we talk about the currency of AI, that's the data, right? And so it's very data hungry. And when you don't have data that's represented of a particular operating environment, even when we should consider that we have a long-term intelligence collection in some of these contexts, then that can lead to hallucinations. And probably the easiest way for the audience to think about this is a driverless vehicle, right? So we'd like to think that a driverless vehicle can tell the difference between a stop sign and not, a yellow, red, green light, someone walking across the road. But now we know anecdotally and factually that oftentimes it cannot. So just scale that up and start thinking about the implications for AI nuclear command and control.
All right. Thanks. I think it's a term that people have heard but don't necessarily understand. So appreciate that. Leah, so in addition to the risk that you're most concerned about, can you also talk about how nuclear close calls historically have involved the misinterpretation of data? In your view, in addition to the risks that you see, do you think that AI will reduce or increase the risk of potential false alarms?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think overall, the thing I'm most concerned about is the ability of governments and individual analysts and contractors to appropriately communicate both the reliability and the vulnerability of AI and the relevant outputs. Because when we talk about AI integration across the nuclear enterprise, it's not just integrating chat GPT. It's not just integrating large language models. It's a plethora of different ways in which AI might affect what is already a systems of systems that is NC3. And so there are going to be some integrations that can be done quite well and should be communicated as being fairly reliable. For example, using weather prediction algorithms to better inform bombers and potential weather patterns that they may face. I feel very good about that. There is a lot of public data about weather prediction algorithms, and they've just gotten better. That is not going to have a real impact on whether or not a bomb gets dropped. If we are to the point that we're needing to have the weather predictions, the decision has been made, and that's separate from that actual algorithm. So for me, that hits all of the right spots of like, yes, we're already doing that. Yes, we're doing that in other non-military domains, and that goes well. We have a ton of data, and that's not going to be radically, changing the mission. And that's something that should be communicated in briefs. Like, yes, it is an algorithm, but we have high reliability. Then you think about things like computer vision algorithms, which are algorithms that can process images or videos and identify visual elements. So for example, I was part of a project where we showed that you could do this on different types of ships. So you could have satellite imagery fed into a model, and you could determine whether something's a carrier or whether it's a destroyer, whether it has an Aegis component on it. That's the sort of thing where, early warning and ISR capabilities are part of NC3. You want to know what's out there. You want to know what your potential targets are. You want to know what sorts of platforms are out there that might be initiating the strike. I feel pretty good about computer vision algorithms identifying and detecting potential elements of interest and communicating that to human operators. Because we have data, we can do real-world testing, we can show that models can get better at identifying and classifying objects. That does not mean that we should have that same assurance in using those models for targeting. And so that's part of what needs to be communicated and sort of delineated throughout all these integrations. There are going to be some applications of very similar algorithms that are going to be much more reliable because we have a lot more data, we have a lot more real-world testing, and there's less of a immediate decision point that hones in on that use. But the very same algorithm, the computer vision algorithm that you would use for identifying versus targeting a ship, very similar algorithms, and I would argue much less reliable in one area versus another. And so my concern is that nuance isn't really getting through. And there's that degree of nuance on basically every possible application of AI throughout the nuclear enterprise. And it looks different at every level. From there, you go to potential decision support systems, which are systems that are going to give actual recommendations to decision makers. Based on the data flow we have, we recommend you take this action. Those could potentially go as far as recommending specific targets. When you have an intelligence analyst that you receive as a decision maker, the onus is on the intelligence analyst who prepared that brief to tell you the varying degrees of certainty or the varying degrees of uncertainty that they have in the information they're presenting you. That's not always the case with large language models, and that can be confused in either way. There are some people who are more likely than they should to trust what's recommended to them by a model, and there are some people who are actually less likely to trust than they should what's recommended to them by a large language model. So I know that's quite a bit of information, but I think my overall argument here is that there are so many ways in which things can be integrated. There's so many different systems that are going to be integrated with, and I just don't know that we have the appropriate nuance to capture when and where things should be trusted and where we need to be integrating secondary analysis or secondary data flow to validate the outputs of a model. And that's important because historically we have seen incidents where we came, really quite close to nuclear war because early machines inappropriately detected launches. So I think lots of people here have probably heard of the Petrov incident. I know that Outrider and the Bulletin have done really excellent work documenting the Petrov incident. So I would really encourage you to go to both of those organizations' websites and read further. But in short, in the early 80s, there was an incident where a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Stanislav Petrov, was on duty at one of the Oko early warning satellites. And these satellites essentially beam out over the horizon, and are meant to detect when there might be an incoming missile launch. And the computer attached to the satellites inadvertently, gave a notice to Stanislav Petrov that there was an incoming launch when there wasn't. And Petrov, received the notice. Normally in the chain of command, he was supposed to report that up and it would get escalated. But he had the foresight to think about the fact that the computer had previous malfunctions. The computer was also reporting there was only a single missile strike, and he had, enough strategic context to think through that if the US was attacking the Soviet Union, they would probably do it with more than just one missile. And so all of these context clues led him to say, I think this is a malfunction in the computer. I'm not going to report this up. I'm not going to escalate it. I'm not going to let this go very much further. That was prevented because we had a human in the line. And going back to my previous points, a human who had the context of when and where reporting from that computer could be reliable and the sort of things that might lead it to be less reliable.
No, thank you for that answer, and also the anecdote. I think it's probably less known than it should be about some of the close calls we've had and how reliant we were on just basic human instinct for understanding, a misinterpretation, a miscalculation. So, lots more, and yes, definitely commend, the Bulletin and Outriders reporting on this. Eduardo, we've talked a lot about the risks, how we got here, the challenges we're facing, the risks that are in the way. Governments are starting to think about how we regulate something that is actually still evolving as we seek to control it. You were heavily involved in the process at the UN General Assembly to adopt a resolution on the risks of AI integration into NC3. Can you outline, the general idea of the resolution, why the government of Mexico and others wanted to push forward this resolution, and sort of how the process went up at the UN? I know, again, that could be a whole dissertation, but just, a general idea. I think a lot of people don't know that governments have already started efforts to try to dig in on these issues. So love to hear your take.
For sure. And yes, like you say, I probably could spend hours and hours speaking about this. There was a lot of things going on previous to that resolution during the negotiation and in the aftermath. But definitely in looking at all of this, the panorama of what's the integration of AI into the military, but especially into NC3, the questions that are arise. And I think that most of those have been flagged one way or another in this conversation right now. And the need to have that further conversation amongst governments that possess those capabilities, and also with others that are concerned about what a catastrophic incident could mean for the rest of the world. When we're talking about nuclear weapons, we need to be mindful that most likely a detonation would have consequences that go beyond a national border, unless it's a very specific incident in the middle of a country and something like that. But if we're talking about the use of a nuclear weapon accidentally in some of these cases, or very deliberately, we are talking about global implications, or at least in a regional scale. So this is why other governments need to be involved. Also, there's a stake for many of them to be mindful of what is happening, and also to be able to produce these questions and to try to look for answers that we can all go behind, like any multilateral process. We see that there's an interest from many governments in putting some sort of guardrail into the integration of AI in military domains. When it comes to nuclear, I think that this is where many countries also draw a red line. In the context of the TPNW, there was a political declaration that came about through one of its meeting of states parties, where there was a clear indication that there was a concern about the integration of AI into NC3, and that there needed to be humans in control when it came to nuclear weapons. So we saw that there was an interest from a good group of countries that are very concerned about nuclear and disarmament. Then at the review conference, the preparatory committee of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NAM states, which is I would say the biggest grouping of countries, the non-aligned movement, they in their statement repeated the same idea, that there needed to be a human in control when it came to nuclear weapons. Of course, all of this thinking that there needs to be disarmament, but in the actuality right now that there's nuclear weapons and AI, that there needs to be humans in the loop. So we saw that there was interest from a very large majority of countries. So we thought maybe this is an angle that needs to be explored. Sometimes at the United Nations, we repeat over and over the same things from the past, from the 70s, from the 80s. So we needed to have something that was up to date and something that I would say is urgent. So I think that that was a clear indication from a good group of countries. But at the same time, we looked at what other countries were already saying, those who possess these capabilities. So the United States and China, in a historic moment, I would say, between two presidents, they were very clear in stating that there needed to be humans in control when it came to nuclear weapons. At the same time, France, UK, and the United States themselves, in the context of the NPT, they were saying something of the similar sort. So we thought that there might be some sort of convergence in that aspect, that countries that have these capabilities are concerned. So then maybe amplify that voice, but then go into maybe the technicalities. Of course, this was not an easy resolution, because this was something that would be going directly into the interest of some of those that have those capabilities, that would, of course, affect their deterrent one way or another. So this is why we thought there's ample ground, at least support, to be able to push something like that, even from the nuclear weapon states. When you go down into the actuality of what is in that resolution, it's a little bit more complicated because of the terminology that is being used here or there. At the beginning, we started with this idea of humans in control, humans in the loop, some sort of oversight or control. The terminology variated until the very end, but I think that the basic concept is that there needs to be a human when we're talking about nuclear weapons and the ultimate decision to use or launch a nuclear weapon. I'm very grateful for all of the explanation that Leah gave right now about the nuances about when AI is being used in the different moments, because I think that some of the arguments that were brought forth was that AI is being mostly used for support in detecting any launch from an adversary or the movement of military equipment from another country. And then maybe the picture is limited to some sort of input, but then the decision is taken by humans. We're also a little bit unsure about how this is being used across all of those countries that have these capabilities, because some have been a little bit more transparent in saying we only use AI for this, this, this. Others, we have no idea of what they're implementing. So we thought that at least at the United Nations, there should be some sort of baseline that all countries with these capabilities, and especially those that would be relying on AI for NC3, would need to be at least getting the same ground rules to understand that if the humans are in the loop, then maybe that's a little bit more acceptable than full automation of something that is as complicated as nuclear weapons. There's already resolutions on artificial intelligence at the United Nations, so we thought we're not going into those aspects, but we need to concentrate on the specific niche of AI and NC3. We were also very clear that this was not going to be a disarmament resolution, because there's already a track about that, and this needed to be more on the angle of nuclear risk reduction, where I think that there has been also a little bit more of convergence between non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states. So we thought, okay, let's move forward where we would see some sort of convergence there, and then have to negotiate the text. So the nitty-gritty of how the resolution came about, maybe that could be some sort of other conversation. I can also not speak about all of the positions that were given, because this is a diplomatic setting. But I would have to point out that I would say the baseline is the first paragraph in the operational section of that resolution that talks about the human in the loop, the human in control, that whenever we're talking about nuclear weapons, and of course with the caveat of pending the total elimination of nuclear weapons, human control and oversight must be maintained. So any country can decide what level of control and oversight that means, and it can be very different at the earlier stages of that operational environment towards the later stage when it would have to mean the actual decision to launch. But the baseline is, if everybody can at least come to that understanding that a human needs to be there for those most critical aspects. Just picking up really quickly about what Paul was mentioning about hallucinations, this I think was something that was very a central part of those deliberations, in saying we cannot just say that AI is fully reliable for many things. And if we see this into day-to-day AI use, I mean, we used to bring this about in the conversations with other colleagues, that probably they were using ChatGPT for redacting emails or something like that. And if we already have these warnings that using ChatGPT or Grok for essential day-to-day things cannot be fully reliable, then the reliability for something as complicated and as sensitive as nuclear, then that would be complicated. So we also wanted to bring in that dimension, the possibility of malfunction and intrusion. And it's not saying that AI is being prohibited in the nuclear domain. It's just setting these guardrails and the appropriateness of transparency, of understanding what this would mean to avoid a catastrophic situation. And of course, that was just the beginning of the conversation, and we're hoping that this resolution will have a longer track.
Yeah, Eduardo, thank you so much for that roundup of where you started the process at the UN and where we're going. We've talked a lot about what governments are doing, but private sector is also integrally, integrated into this conversation too. And so, Paul, why don't we start with you about, the military's not doing this on their own. They're working with private corporations. Are there guardrails that need to be put in place, transparency mechanisms to make sure that private industry are also thinking about the risks of their potential products, and that they're also connected into the conversation about regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think as a sort of first principle, the United States, which is leading the effort for global norm setting, I think we'd have to admit, has published through the Department of War a directive that stipulates human oversight control of AI-enabled systems to include decision support systems like the ones we're talking about at scale, tactically and strategically, for the use of nuclear capabilities. And if I could just for a second, this notion of control is actually really, really important as relates to not just public attitudes, but military attitudes, which is uber important because these operators within the military are going to be the ones literally pushing the button based upon political oversight in direction. Control is important as well because when we talk about decision-making in this context, only humans have affect or emotion, and decision-making is inherently emotional. There's some research that states that large language models, when asked the question, do you support intervention to include the use of nuclear weapons, would say yes as a first course, and then second, they discount casualties for both foreign but also friendly or domestic, which is really important to be aware of because of the so-called nuclear taboo, which is based in large measure on the sort of casualty count, casualty outcomes. And so human control is really, really important for operator, but it's also embedded within sort of strategic governing documents within the Department of Defense. And I think, actually, I know that other countries have come together in somewhat of an epistemic community to actually ascribe to this notion as well going forward. Additionally, I think the broader storyline here as well is that when you take a look at the last 50 or so years of defense acquisition processes, for the most part, it's been the Department of Defense which has explicated a requirement based upon a gap or limitation of which it sought industry participation to build a capability. That dynamic is completely flipped on its head in this modern era, which is to say that now we have technical industry partners, you've heard it in turn, tech bros, that are promulgating, promoting capability incorporated with AI that unless or until a country or a military would adopt it, you'd be at grave risk, you'd be outpaced, you would lose your ability to lethally overmatch an opponent. And so with the new renewal of great power competition, that's a fairly heady comment, but I think what we have to be aware of is really the line of reasoning that Leah was talking about. A lot of these capabilities lack validation. God forbid we would actually be in a position to validate it. And so I think we have to be really aware of the sort of angles of model simulation that we could use to potentially stress test these capabilities because we know that there's unmitigated potential for hallucination. But in sum, I think that human control is really the leitmotif that wraps us all together. There are strategic governing documents that talk about that being important, and that is important for industry partners to align capability development, testing, experimentation to that standard.
Thanks for that. Leah, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to get a last question in with everybody. We're running out of time. So Paul and Eduardo, please be thinking about a recommendation you'd like to make to the audience on something that they could read or watch to learn more about this. And Leah will give you the last pick on that. But before, can you talk about your recommendations for better linking the expert community, government policymakers, and private industry to actually coordinate in the necessary way to make sure that as we see AI increasingly incorporated into these kinds of structures, including NC3, that we're doing it as safely as we possibly can?
Yes. And shocker, the academic researcher is going to advocate for more academic research. But I do think I'm correct in this. So one of my biggest concerns in this space is that we have spent a lot of time over the past few years thinking about hypothetical use cases. And for me, that's all good and well, but we have real world wars that we need to be looking at in much more depth than we currently are. Lots of my work right now is focused on learning the lessons of AI integration in the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. I want to see more work on that. We are now at the point where we have real world examples of conflicts that have had AI integration, from everything into warfighters using large language models on their phone, all the way to some fairly sophisticated, meshed together, very quickly early warning systems. And we should be learning the lessons of all of that because there are a lot more corollaries in conventional warfighting to nuclear warfighting than where our field gives credit to. And the reality of it is we are at a point where there's really impressive AI development happening, but development does not equal adoption. There are some really cool things you can do with AI right now. I can walk down to the Berkeley AI Research Lab just a few blocks over from where I am now and go see some crazy things. I don't really count those as fully fielded capabilities until I see broad adoption. And what determines what gets adopted is inciting incidents, things like the war in Ukraine, like the war in Gaza. Those are moments in which countries find themselves in fairly dire straits and look around and use what they have around. And so I think learning from what countries choose to integrate in those moments is a much better indicator of the types of technologies that we're going to see integrated over the next year, 2 years, 3 years throughout the nuclear enterprise than just looking at the bleeding edge of industry, because sometimes those are exquisite things that do not scale or do not suit this moment very well. So I think we need to spend a little bit more time studying those real world corollaries, the commercial ones, yes, but particularly how AI is already being used, and then using that to better have the conversations between industry, between government, between civil society and academia, saying this is what is actually being used, and these are the risks in what is actually being used. I'm not terribly concerned. I know there are some who I greatly disagree with who are concerned about, AGI taking over the world and destroying us. If it comes to that, I don't really know that we can do much about it. I'm much more interested in, real world, real risks. And I think we can do a much better job about updating our priors about what those look like based on real world instances. I don't want to be all on the negative though. And so for my recommendation, I do want to say that AI is a scaling capability. So yes, it gives competitors and adversaries a chance to make up some ground, but it also gives us, both us as, the US and its allies, but also us as civil researchers, the opportunity to have much more insights into what's happening around the world. And so my recommendation to you to read is a really excellent report done by Matt Korda and Igor Morik called Inspections Without Inspectors, a path forward for nuclear arms control verification with what they call cooperative technical means. And it's a really nice report to remind you that these capabilities are useful in a million ways, one of which is being able to do better verification at a time when we are in a post-arms control world. And I think that's worth highlighting.
Thanks, Leah. Eduardo, very quickly, what's your recommendation? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, my recommendation, I would go on the opposite side of Leah not being overly concerned or dramatic, but I would really encourage people to look at the original Terminator movie again. I'm not joking about this. In the 80s, it seemed like science fiction, but today we have lethal autonomous weapon systems that can really go the extra mile in doing a lot of things on their own. And then AI is being connected to nuclear weapons. I would say that is the scenario, and I would see it as a really big possibility rather than science fiction. My other one is also Dr. Strangelove. Even though it seems as comic at the moment, if we see it with current eyes, I would say that it's not as far off. And then if you add the AI dimension, I am more concerned today. And just very quickly, I would say that we need beyond government to government, but also with industry, the discussion with those coders that I'm sure they would not like to see their algorithms being used into the possible incineration of millions of people. I'm sure that they would have a different perspective.
Thanks, Eduardo, and always love Dr. Strangelove plugs. Paul, you got the last word.
Well, I'm old enough to remember Terminator. I'm going to rewatch it, and see if I'm really scared at this point. So I have a lot of recommendations, but one of the things, and not that we've done that here, that we often discount in the context of strategic decision-making for the use of nuclear weapons is the importance of leaders and political control. And so I may just draw from my broad research on drone warfare and the importance of rules of engagement, which are set by political officials, and make an analogy to nuclear command and control, that it's a way that officials ingest information and intelligence, whether it's filtered through sort of their own beliefs, vivid experiences, or the expertise of their analyst, that will ultimately lead to certain decisions for better, for worse. And so I would commend your audience to take a look at some of the great work by Karen Yardy-Millo, who's now a dean at Columbia University. She takes a look at intelligence for strategic decision-making.
Fantastic. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks to the audience for tuning in. This is a topic we're going to return to. There's so much more to discuss. So please visit the Bulletin, stay up to date on our next coming events. Thanks to our friends and colleagues at Outrider for the partnership on this event. We'll be back in March with our next event, which we will announce soon. So stay tuned to our newsletter, subscribe on YouTube so you can catch us when we go live. And thank you to Leah, to Eduardo, to Paul for your time today. And we hope to see you all again soon.
Recording stopped.
Ah, the Terminator pick. I didn't